But I'm very glad and honored to be asked to introduce our two speakers and panel this afternoon. So there's lots of seating for everybody who's coming in, and it will be a great discussion. We have with us Jane Lubchenco, the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're also used to saying NOAA, that we all have to trip over what it actually means. The first woman director of it, extremely distinguished in her field, and one of several women directors she was telling me of what we also call the AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the International Council for Science, and all sorts of things that you can read about in your biography. But she's also, importantly, trained as a marine biologist. And given the topic of today's discussion, that could hardly be more apropos, because it's about the BP oil spill and the consequences for the ecosystems around the Gulf, and what policies should be for the present and the future to think about how to preserve it and how to react now and into the future. And we couldn't have a better questioner and moderator than Andrea Mitchell, who is NBC's chief foreign affairs correspondent and the host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports, which we were very lucky will be broadcast live from this very place tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. Andrea will obviously perform brilliantly, as she always does, but you are to forgive any possible lapse or glitch, because she arrived at Andrews Air Force Base this morning at 4 a.m. from Baghdad and somehow managed to get herself here in time for this panel. So we give a special welcome to them both.
Thank you so much. So you can imagine the culture shock. After we had planned all of this, I had the extraordinary opportunity, really, to be a correspondent. There were two of us. I was the only television correspondent traveling with Joe Biden to Baghdad. It was a secret mission, so we didn't really know about it till last Thursday. So we scrambled back and arrived this morning. And with the help of great friends, I got here. So thank you all. It is wonderful to be back at Ideas Festival, and particularly to be moderating this session. We are privileged, to have Jane Lubchenco here, who is so well regarded, and it's one of the great fortunate facts for the country in the midst of this terrible crisis, that we have Dr. Lubchenco, with her experience and her academic and scientific knowledge, as head of NOAA at this terrible time in history. You have some remarks you want to set the table for us, and then we'll have the question and answers, and then bring all of you into it.
Thanks, Andrea. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I thought I would make a few opening remarks just to set the stage for the conversation that Andrea and I are going to be having. So let me begin by remarking that as we gather here in Aspen, surrounded by such incredible natural beauty, and as a Colorado native, I take great pride in this. But as we are also inspired by all the ideas of the Idea Festival, a human tragedy and an environmental disaster are continuing to unfold in the Gulf. And one of the ideas that I would like to bring to this festival is an idea that emerges from this disaster, specifically that healthy oceans matter. They matter for a number of different reasons. They matter to the thousands of men and women who work on the water, continuing a way of life that defines so many coastal communities today. They matter to the creatures large and small that call the Gulf home. They matter to many of our personal happiness, whether supporting a way of life or enabling us to just take a walk on a nice, pristine beach and do some bird watching or watch turtles hatch. Healthy oceans also matter to the vibrancy of our coastal communities, and they matter to our nation's economic prosperity. So in sum, I would suggest to you that healthy oceans matter, in large part because they are an expression of our commitment to one another, to the rest of life on our planet, and to the future. As a scientist who has studied our oceans for more than 35 years, I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the health, both short-term and long-term, the effects of the BP oil spill. I've heard lots of Gulf residents. I've been there 5 times now, most recently with Vice President Biden right before he took off with you. I've heard Gulf Coast residents express deep anger, deep anxiety, real frustration, and genuine concern about the future, about what this spill means to them and to their livelihoods. As administrator of NOAA, I've been involved in this response from the very outset. And I can tell you this has been an unprecedented event. It has evolved in a very dynamic way, and our responses continue to evolve in an equally dynamic way. NOAA is the lead scientific advisor to the Coast Guard and to the entire federal family for oil spills. And so we play that very important role, bringing science to the table. And as stewards of our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes, we also have responsibility for paying special attention to the health of that system. And everyone at NOAA has been all hands on deck in response to this spill from the outset, leading much of the federal response in a way that is scientific, that is strategic, and very, very aggressive. Since the very early days, NOAA's war room in Seattle was stood up, was generating predictions about where the oil would go, providing spot weather forecasts on a twice daily basis. And since then, it's been more and more assets of NOAA brought to the table. Right now, we have satellites in space, we have planes in the air, we have ships and buoys on the water, we have gliders under the water, scientists on the ground, and information online is sort of a way of synthesizing all the different parts of NOAA that are involved in this effort. And of course, NOAA is just a single agency, and we are working very closely with the rest of the federal partners for what is undoubtedly the largest federal response to an oil spill in our history. So as the scientific advisor to the oil spill and as stewards of our oceans, what in fact are we doing? Well, we're addressing questions like, where is the oil going? What does that mean to sea turtles? What does it mean to marine mammals? What does it mean to the small creatures that are in the water that the turtles and the mammals depend on? How should cleanup efforts go? What's the best cleanup method? What's the best long-term restoration methods? How would a hurricane affect the spill? And many more kinds of questions. Where can I fish? Is my seafood safe to eat? Those are the kinds of things that we are working actively on. So that's sort of a snapshot of some of the things that NOAA is engaged in. And I emphasize that this is truly an environmental disaster, but even more than that, it's really a human tragedy. And this is, it's just so poignant that those two are brought, that the interrelation of those two is brought home by this tragedy in no uncertain terms, the connectedness between people and healthy oceans. So, as is the case with the rest of the federal family, we remain committed to doing our utmost until the oil is stopped, until it's cleaned up, until everyone who has been compensated should be, until the Gulf is brought back to health and the communities made whole. Now that's a tall order, and it's going to take a lot of time. So in closing, I just want to remind everybody that this tragedy began to unfold as we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of Earth Day. And if that isn't ironic, I don't know what is. Earth Day was part of the legacy of the Santa Barbara oil spill, the blowout in 1969. And that and the environmental movement led directly to the creation or the passage of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Endangered Species Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, and the creation of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I think it is appropriate, even though that's not the focus of the federal effort right now, but it is appropriate for this Ideas Festival for each of us to consider what do we want the legacy of this event to be, given that it is happening. What is the good that can come from this? 40 years from now, what will be the legacy of this disaster? And from my own perspective, one outcome should be a commitment to healthy oceans, because I believe that healthy oceans matter.
Let's talk about healthy oceans, because there's so much attention, for obvious and important reasons, to the surface effects and the effects on the marshlands. Yep. But there is so much going on the ocean floor and throughout the ocean, the oxygen system, the acidity. Yep. Could you tell us, first of all, the damage that we're not seeing?
The images that you see at the surface are only part of the story. You're absolutely right. And that's both the oil that's at the surface that is being skimmed and is being collected, and it's also oil that is up on the marshes. What is hidden is the oil beneath the surface. And because this well is at 5,000 feet down, I mean, that's what's so amazing about this. It is so deep. As that oil is making its way to the surface, not all of it gets up to the surface. It gets broken up, fractionated. The lighter fractions are separated from the heavier ones, and the turbulence in the water breaks the oil up into smaller and smaller droplets. And what we are seeing from many of our research vessels that are out there is the appearance of a cloud of very fine droplets spread over an area in the general vicinity of the well that are, if you take a scoop of that water and bring it to the surface, you can't really see much in it because it's in parts per million. So it's very, very fine droplets, and they are very diffuse, but it's a very identifiable cloud that's between about 3,300 feet and about 4,600 feet. So there is this layer that is staying down there in the general vicinity of the well. And that layer is introducing a lot of carbon into this ecosystem, and we don't know what the fate of that will be. This is really unprecedented. We are actively monitoring the oxygen in the water in those areas. It is not abnormally low. It's slightly lower than normal, but it's not abnormally low, and it's not of serious concern yet, but we continue to monitor that. As that oil, which is highly toxic, comes into contact with small larvae, with eggs of fish, for example, or other creatures, it is undoubtedly poisonous to them. But the image that many people have of this underwater lake of oil, that's not what's happening down there. It's not a lake of black ooze that's down there. It's this cloud of fine mist, and its impact is likely to be considerable, but we don't yet know exactly what it will be.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the EPA initially tested the dispersant that BP was using and eventually decided that it does not harm the endocrine systems in the aquatic life. There might be some skepticism out there because the EPA, after 9/11, had certain judgments about air quality which turned out to be not correct. What is your scientific analysis of the dispersant issue?
The dispersant issue is a very challenging one, and it really highlights many of the dilemmas of a real disaster like this. Oil is really, really nasty stuff. And so the question is, do you only clean it up with mechanical means, which is what we're trying to do at the surface, and you can't get all of it that way, especially when a lot of the stuff that comes to the surface is in this highly emulsified form. It's this mousse, the orangey stuff that you see in the pictures. That's really hard to collect and hard to clean up. And so the use of dispersants, in principle, is to break up oil into smaller and smaller pieces so that the natural bacteria in the ocean can biodegrade it in the way that would happen naturally. And the idea of dispersants is to have that happen faster. Now, the dispersants that were on the approved list by EPA are the ones that are being used. The ones that BP chose to use are the ones that are readily available on the shelf. They have a longer shelf life than some of the less toxic ones. But EPA has directed BP to use the minimum amount and to use less toxic ones. And this is really a question of trade-offs. The dispersants themselves are mildly toxic, but they break down very quickly. And as far as we know, the breakdown products are not toxic to anything that has been tested yet. EPA has been doing their tests. NOAA has launched another series of tests so that we can better understand if there are other impacts on other species, and we're still in the middle of conducting those. So I think this is an area where, as far as we know, there aren't serious impacts, but we don't know everything that we would like to.
Now, I read that there is an agreement with the biologists, according to environmental groups, BP and the Coast Guard, where biologists will be able to go out on vessels before burns take place to see what the impact would be on the sea turtles. Is that
Correct.
working? Is that underway?
Even before the most recent court case began to play out, we had discussions, NOAA had discussions with the Coast Guard about the importance of having observers on every single vessel that was corralling the oil and then burning it. And that's now in place and seems to be working very, very well. We always had procedures where planes were flying overhead in anticipation of possible burns in an area. And anytime there are marine mammals or sea turtles that are sighted, then those areas cannot be burned. So we had that, but now we have observers on ships as well, and I'm hopeful that that will be effective.
From your assets in the air and at sea and in space, what can you tell us today about the loop current and the likelihood that the oil will get to Florida? There's one report today that it has reached Texas, tar balls. It's not clear from the last that I read whether that was oil tracking in from ships that had been in the Gulf or actually water, the current taking
Correct.
it. But so that would, if it has reached Texas, that means that oil has reached all 5 of the Gulf states. But what about the east coast of Florida? What is your prognosis on the loop current?
The loop current is a current of warm water that comes up between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba and normally goes into the Gulf. It can go fairly far up into the Gulf, and then it turns toward Florida, goes down along the Florida west coast, joins the Florida current in the Florida Strait, and then joins the Gulf Stream. So that's sort of the normal state, if you will, of the loop current. But it's a very dynamic current, and it changes frequently. We've deployed a lot of both satellites and planes and ships and gliders to really understand what the loop current is doing. And I can tell you that at the present time, it is not a vehicle for transporting oil to the Florida Keys or to the East Coast. The reason it's not is that the top of the loop current has now pinched off, and it is a freestanding eddy. It even has a name. It's called Eddy Franklin, and it is spinning around. I don't know who named this one, but there are. This one is spinning around clockwise in the Gulf, and so any oil, it's still pretty far away from the main bulk of the oil that's on the surface, but any oil that is entrained in that then would be retained in the Gulf. Should that eddy reattach to the loop current, or should the loop current invade the Gulf, if you will, then it could be a mechanism for transporting oil to the Keys. However, as oil moves through the ocean, it becomes weathered. And in the transit time from where it is now to the Florida Keys, for example, that would likely be on the order of at least 6 to 12 days. And during that time, it becomes more and more weathered, which means that the lighter fractions are evaporated off. And so what you end up with are just tar balls and streamers instead of this chocolatey, gunky stuff that you see coming ashore any other places in the Gulf right now.
Well, one of the things that can affect the loop current, as well as everything else, is the storm system. It is hurricane season. Tropical storm Bonnie is now forming. Do we know anything about the path of that storm and how it might affect it?
As you know, the National Weather Service is part of NOAA, and this is something that we have been tracking very, very closely. Every year, the National Weather Service issues an outlook for what we think the upcoming hurricane season will be. The season starts June 1 and goes for 6 months. And what we announced at the end of May is that all signs are pointing to an above average hurricane season this year. The predictions from the National Hurricane Center are that we can expect on the order of 14 to 23 named storms, 8 to 14 hurricanes, and 3 to 7 major hurricanes. Those are categories 3, 4, or 5. So that's the outlook for the hurricanes in the Atlantic this year. Now, not all of those will make landfall. Not all of those will enter the Gulf, although obviously we just had Alex, which was the first hurricane of the season and the first June hurricane since 1996. So I think this is an area that we are tracking very, very closely and giving advance warning as much as possible to the Coast Guard, to BP, to the entire Unified Command, because should a hurricane come into the Gulf like Alex did, it could do considerable damage, either just disrupting the operations or worse. Alex was hundreds of miles away from the well site, and yet the waves that were generated by that storm really impaired much of the cleanup operation. Skimming couldn't happen, burning couldn't happen, anything else. Fortunately, the drilling of the relief wells was able to continue, and the capture of the oil from the top hat was able to continue. But should a major hurricane come significantly closer, then many of those operations would need to cease so that we could get people out of harm's way. So it's going to be challenging next few months.
Now, back in 2007, before this administration, the Minerals Management Service set a conclusion about deep water drilling and its possible impact of a spill on fish and wildlife. And the Fish and Wildlife Service agreed with the management conclusion on this, despite the concerns of environmentalists. Has that been changed? I know it's out of your purview, but with your longstanding concern about the aquatic life.
I think this spill is, we're already seeing it causing people to rethink all sorts of things. Assumptions, plans that were in place, understandings, and we are already seeing that, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of that.
Now, before we open this up to questions on the oil spill, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about something that you've worked on for so long, which is conservation, fishery conservation, and the whole idea of restructuring the fishing industry for catch shares, or what the impact would be and why it's so important.
NOAA has responsibility for managing the federal fisheries, and we have a goal of having fisheries be ending overfishing. In fact, we have to do that by law. The Magnuson-Stevens Act requires that we end overfishing by next year, and we are making good progress with some fisheries, but not enough of them. Too many of our fisheries are in trouble. And we are open to approaching as many innovative ideas as possible in managing fisheries. The traditional type of fishery management is top-down command and control, where you can fish, how you can fish, what kind of gear, what the season is, et cetera. And if you look globally across the 11,000 fisheries around the world, scientific analyses indicate that those that are managed with traditional approaches, like we have typically done in the United States, are by and large not doing well, whereas fisheries that are managed under some kind of catch share program are being sustainable. And the concept of a catch share is very simple. The fishermen or communities or entities in a fishery, might be communities, it might be fishermen, it might be groups of fishermen, are each allocated a fraction of the catch. And the total amount of fish that can be caught in any year is capped, but each one has a fraction of the catch. So you might have 10% of the catch, I might have 5% of the catch. And we are responsible for stopping fishing when we have reached our limit, number one. So the accountability, the burden is on you. But there is good monitoring, so everybody knows when that's happening.
Is the industry willing to go along with a cooperative approach?
The ones that have done it are wildly enthusiastic about it. And more to the point, all of a sudden, the economic and conservation interests are aligned because it's in your interest to make sure the fishery is healthy, because you would like to see the value of your 10% grow through time. And right now your 10% may be only X ton of fish. You'd like it to be double that or triple that, and so you want the fishery to be healthy. And so your long-term interest, your long-term economic interest is now aligned with conservation. And so catch share fisheries are changing the economics of fishing and making it more enticing to fish sustainably than to just have the race for fish, which is going on, where every single fisherman is catching as much as they possibly can before somebody else does, and in the end, way overfish the whole system, which is typically, not always, but often what happens. So in NOAA, we are encouraging the fishery management councils to consider catch shares where appropriate. So we're not forcing anybody to do anything, but we're taking the excuses away, if you will, and making it easier to switch to a more sustainable type of fishery management. Now that's only appropriate for some kinds of fisheries, not all. Works better for commercial fishing than for recreational fishing, for example. But it's an idea whose time has come and is actually working quite well.
Well, on that bright note, let's open it up for questions. There are handheld mics, and if you could bring a mic up here first. It's a little backlit, so I'm having a little trouble seeing people. So if I don't recognize you and you're my best friend, please forgive.
Excuse me.
Maybe you could stand, we'd hear you a little better.
This may be a stupid question, but why would it not be feasible to simply cap the well with a very large steel plate? I mean, right now, we have floating above the well a 500,000-ton oil tanker, which has been converted to a skimmer. It's a huge piece of equipment. It's over 1,000 feet long. So certainly, you know, the capability of creating an enormous metal plate to put over the well is entirely feasible. And I'm just curious why that approach has not been considered.
The first, the emphasis has always been from the outset on stopping the flow of the oil. And in addition to BP, the president convened some of the best scientific minds in the country to bring all of their best ideas and try to figure out how to stop the flow of oil. They have been working really, really hard and have been they have been suggesting a number of new ideas to the team that's working on this. And I can tell you that they have explored pretty much every option and have tried, as you know, many, many things that haven't worked. We are currently capturing more and more and more. BP is capturing, not me. BP is capturing more and more of the oil. And once the Helix producer gets in place, then that will be up to about 50,000 barrels a day. But the whole idea of killing the well was the goal from the outset. Right now, it looks like the best way to do that is going to be through the relief wells. And BP initially started digging one, and the president said, no, we need redundancy, and they directed BP to do a second one. So those are on track, and it looks as though that's going to be probably the best solution, the best end game for this, at least for stopping
May I
the
even
flow.
add to that? Only because I heard on an interview that we did from Thad Allen when that question was asked, why not take a huge tanker and just sink it over the well? And the response was that oil will find a way to get out, that it would eventually get out, number one. And number two, it could create so much pressure that it would create more problems under the seabed. And instead of having what we hope is still a pipe that can be plugged, if it has not been too degraded, which is another whole issue, you would then have a catastrophic, potentially worse catastrophe under the seabed because it would break it up and then it would spread. That's a non-scientific, journalistic answer.
That's correct, Andrea. That's correct. Good job.
Considering I got
Good
very
job.
bad grades in science, I'm very proud of myself. Where are the microphones? Right up here, and then we'll move around. Thank you.
My question is directed more to existing applications for deep sea drilling, particularly in the Arctic Ocean, where the conditions are even more severe and difficult and challenging than in the Gulf. What do you believe will be the outcome as a consequence of the existing oil spill on those applications, the ones that are already underway? Can they still be stopped at this point, or is that something, the genie that's out the bottle?
I think this event is causing everyone to rethink the drilling practices every place. And the Arctic is a particularly vulnerable environment. We don't understand how oil behaves in really, really cold water. Once it gets under the ice, it would be next to impossible to recover it. So there are a lot, and there's some very, very vulnerable species and habitats up there. So there are very many reasons to be concerned. We've pushed the pause button on the Arctic in terms of the federal decisions right now. And I think that we will be seeing a number of opportunities to just rethink a lot of the activities up there in the coming months to years.
In the back? In the way back? Yeah, that gentleman there.
Isn't there some controversy on whether the relief wells will work? And if they don't, what then?
As far as I know, in previous situations where there has been a blowout that could not be controlled at the wellhead, the relief wells have in fact been the solution. I think there is great hope that there will be, that these will in fact, one of the two will work. The first one is getting close. And I think it's looking good from what we can tell in terms of being well positioned. But it's not a sure thing, and I think everybody is crossing their fingers. There are backup plans that are being prepared, but I think there is great hope that this, in fact, will put an end to this disaster.
Can you speak to the backup plans if, worst case scenario, the relief wells, we know that it does involve robotic engineering on a mile under the water and horizontally, and to actually have this connection made. But then it does rely also on the piping being able to handle the pressure of packing that, whatever the mud,
The drilling mud.
drilling mud is. What if it doesn't work? What kind of options are there?
I think everything is being done now to maximize the likelihood that it will work. number one, which is why they're being really, really careful as they get closer and closer. There are other plans that are being discussed that are looking at ways to stop the flow. And my hope is just that, I'm not an engineer. I don't understand all of that. That's not part of my responsibility. I'm just very hopeful that it'll happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, there's a question way over there. Yes. If you can get a mic down that way. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Bob Massey. I'm curious, given the comments that you've made about how dangerous oil is as a substance for the oceans and concerns that we have scientifically about the effect of the burning of greenhouse gases, it seems that this should be an enormous teachable moment for the American people and for the world about the overall danger of relying on carbon fuels. And yet, I'm wondering, and I realize this goes beyond a question of science, but since Americans seem to have had some trouble embracing the science of all of these issues, do you see, both personally in your own role and then perhaps politically for the administration, this as an opportunity to make some even greater claims about the direction that we must move, and urgently, away from this very dangerous but highly prevalent substance?
So I think the president has been clear in articulating the need for the nation to move toward clean energy and to, at the same time, reduce dependence on foreign oil. And I think the administration policies are trying to balance that combination of goals. The president has had announced significant new investments in renewable energies, and moving more and more toward that direction is where I believe the country needs to be going, and where there has been a very significant investment by this administration in enabling us to move in that direction.
Can we take a question here? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that in Canada and many European countries, they are required to have relief wells whenever they're doing deep drilling. Is that correct? And if
Actually,
it is,
I don't know if that's correct or not. Sorry.
And working our way back there. Thanks.
Why was there such a poor job of estimating how much was leaking out initially? And number two, for the areas of Louisiana that were hit hardest, how many years before you'd expect those marshes, et cetera, to recover?
Estimating the flow rate, how much oil is coming out at any particular time, is actually a really difficult thing to do because you can't observe it directly. Initially, the estimates of around 5,000, at least 5,000 barrels a day, were based on what was being seen at the surface. And at that time, we didn't realize that so much of the oil was not making it to the surface and was staying subsurface. The information that we had to do the estimation of the flow rate depended on having high-quality video of a long enough segment that you could do analyses. And some of the early publicly reported analyses were based on very, very low resolution, very, very short clips. And the scientists that have been on the flow rate technical team from across the agencies and with academic scientists as well said that you really can't make those estimates until we get better quality video, higher resolution, faster shutter speed, if you will, and longer length. And so it wasn't until we had that better video that the flow rate technical team was able to make the calculations that they did. Now, to make those calculations, you have to make some assumptions about how much of the stuff that you're seeing in the video is gas and how much of it is oil. And when the before the riser pipe was cut and it was kind of snaking around down there, it was, the engineers now think in hindsight, was actually changing the relative proportion of oil to gas intermittently, so that as it was flowing through this tube, it was being modified. And so you would get gushes of methane and gushes of oil. So it turned out it wasn't quite so easy, because what you see in one snippet isn't necessarily typical of what's happening all the time. So the flow rate technical team has been working really, really diligently and I think very responsibly to analyze the images. We also had a second piece of critical information. The scientists asked BP to put pressure sensors in the flow so they could actually get more information. And that combination of images from the where the oil is coming out and from what we know about the surface was all combined to give the flow rate that we're using currently, which is between 35 and 60,000 barrels a day. So that's the best number that we have at present. And I think everyone fully expects that that may be revised as we get more information. And maybe I hope that gives you a little bit more insight into why this is a little more challenging than at first blush it might seem to be.
Should it, from now on, if something were to happen like this, should it be required that the oil company provide the government with high-resolution video? They had it.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things early on that BP was not doing, and that the government essentially made them do, was provide us with that information. And so early on, I think there were, so the federal government has been insistent that BP do a number of things, and that was one of them. And so if we had that earlier on, we could have done those calculations.
So in future protocols could be
It
more
should include that.
rigorous
Exactly.
in terms of demanding that
Yep.
of the oil company.
Correct. Now, I should also emphasize, though, Andrea, that the federal response was in no way constrained by those early flow estimates. None of us thought that that was the estimate that we were working with, but the number of everything that we were gathering, whether it was at the surface or people or assets, we're anticipating a much more significant effort, just because we were erring on the side of caution. So we were not so focused on getting the number right because it was very difficult, and because we didn't have the information, and because the effort really was very aggressive even early on.
In the back, and then we'll move over here.
Scott Chotin from New Orleans. According to the modeling, how likely is it that oil may enter Lake Pontchartrain through the Wrigley's?
The recent reports have suggested that they're already seeing tar balls in that area, in the riolets. So there has been a massive effort to try to prevent that from happening. And I think that effort will continue, because that would not be a desirable outcome. But it is just, the oil just keeps coming, and it keeps coming toward New Orleans. And it's just, this is such an unprecedented disaster. And it just keeps, most oil spills that happen are, a one-off thing. And this one is just so different from that in so many different ways. And the shores that I visited, various places, from Grand Isle to Venice to Chandeleurs, it's just really, really sobering and sad to see that oil. And I was on Grand Isle, for example. One day I was out with some of the SCAT teams that go out and do shoreline assessment to say what kind of oil is there, in what amounts, what the best cleanup methods are. They look at where there are sensitive habitats, rookeries, or other things in the vicinity, so that when the cleanup teams come in, they have some information to go on. And we were out there, and one of the protocols that the SCAT teams use is to not just look at what's on the surface, but to use a shovel and a spade and actually dig into this was a sandy beach, dig into the sand. And you could see a lot of oil at the surface. It was this chocolatey, sort of chocolate cake-like mixture. Before you bake the cake, it's sort of chocolatey, what the batter. It looks like batter. That's sort of what it looks like. So that was at the surface, and you dig down into this, and about this far down, there was another layer of this, a little more weathered, but still very obvious oil. And that had come in a week before, and then there had been a storm, and the storm kicks up the sand, and the sand buried the oil, and then there's oil on top. And so I think many, many of the beaches are going to be multi-layers of oil. And so cleanup of these is going to be a major, major challenge. It's not just as simple as skimming it off the surface.
Do you think that it's likely that it will reach Lake Pontchartrain?
I sure hope not. But
not a very good prognosis.
It's hard to stop when it's just really hard to stop. It's not just the oil that's at the surface. There's a lot of oil that's just subsurface, and you can see it in the waves that are crashing, and if the oil gets sand entrained in it, then it gets heavier, and then it gets resuspended. And so all along many of the shorelines, you see a lot of oil that is, in the top few layers. And that's really hard to collect. The skimmers are getting some, the booms are getting some, but it's hard to get all of it, especially when we have storms come through and they disrupt the boom. It's so frustrating.
There was a question over there, yes.
Question about relief well drilling. There's nowhere in the world that requires that currently, or concurrent drilling of a relief well. My question was, when the cloud that you talked about of the droplets is mostly at 3,300 and down, isn't that well below where fishing takes place? And is most of the cloud off where the well is, more than 100 miles offshore, or is that moving in much closer, and that's what causes your concern as it gets into shallower water?
The concern, so I think it's really important to understand that the Gulf is a very three-dimensional habitat. And there are things that live on the bottom, and there are things that swim primarily at the top. But a lot of the things, the different levels in the water column move up and down. And for example, there are many small animals called zooplankton that are in farther deep in the water during the daytime, and they come up to feed at night when their predators are less active, and then they go back down during the daytime. So let's say that those are encountering some of this small cloud of mist, and then when they go up to feed, they in fact are eaten by some of the predators. They can't avoid all of them. And so some of those predators might be the ones that you might want to go fishing for example. So the system is a very dynamic one, both in space and in time. It's a very three-dimensional system. And so even though this mist of carbon that we've identified is fairly diffuse and is fairly low in the water column, it still has the potential to interact with most of the species that are in the system because they interact. The species move around and they interact with one another.
How is that affecting the acidity of the water? Have you been able to judge, or is it different, obviously, as you move out?
Oceans every place are becoming more acidic because much of the carbon dioxide that we have pumped into the atmosphere is being absorbed by oceans. And when carbon dioxide is absorbed by oceans, it makes them more acidic. And that's happening in the Gulf. It's happening to oceans every place. They have become 30% more acidic in the last 100 or so years than they were before because of this absorption of carbon dioxide. The addition of oil, of hydrocarbons to this system is not affecting the level of acidity in any demonstrable way that we know of so far. There are other problems that it's likely to cause.
Such as?
Well, just so much, just this massive infusion of carbon into the system. I guess another thing that's important to understand about the Gulf is that there is a lot of hydrocarbon in the Gulf system already. And that hydrocarbon is from other oil spills, and it is from natural methane seeps, of which there are lots and lots and lots in the Gulf. And as likely as a result, there are a lot of bacteria in that system that naturally biodegrade. They eat that methane, they eat the carbon. And despite that, this massive infusion of even more carbon is likely to be disruptive to that ecosystem. And we don't yet know all the ways that that will play out. It can certainly kill a lot of young stages. Let's say bluefin tuna, for example. There are only 2 known spawning areas for bluefin tuna from the Atlantic, and the Gulf is one of those. And this time of year, there are bluefin tuna eggs and bluefin tuna larvae, the young juvenile stages, that are in the water column. And if they are affected by the oil, this is already a species that's in very, very serious trouble. If they are affected by this oil, then that will undoubtedly have very serious consequences to those populations. And the same is true of lots of other species.
We have about 5 minutes left, so 1 or 2 questions. There's a lady in the back.
One allegation that I've heard is that BP took the approach that it did originally because it wanted to reuse the well eventually, or to drill in the well eventually. And if they had been willing to kill the well to never use that particular reservoir again, they would have taken a different approach, which might have been more successful. I wonder if you think that there's any truth to that.
I wouldn't even speculate on what BP intended. I would have no way of knowing that. What I can tell you is that the scientists, including Stephen Chu, who's the Secretary of Energy, and the other folks that he has brought into this command center in Houston to be looking over BP's shoulder and watching everything that they are doing, would not have stood for that. I don't know, what they were told or not told about intentions, but they were bringing everything to the table in terms of stopping the flow of oil. And that has been the federal focus throughout.
One quick final question. Yes, ma'am. Could you wait for the microphone just a sec? Thank you.
Hi, Shelley Porgas. You started the conversation by saying that healthy oceans matter, and they matter not only to marine life, but to human life. Who is measuring the impact on human life? We have a son who went down to New Orleans to help rebuild after Katrina. He's still there. I very much worry that this is a community that's going to have long-term health impacts from all of this, from perhaps oil, seeping into well water and other aspects of life down there. So it's not just the economic life, but talking about people's personal health.
Yep. I think there are multiple ways that may play out. It's obvious that the economics of the Gulf is being affected, but people's physical health, people's mental health, this on top of the other disasters that they have weathered, and the great uncertainty about what the future holds. I've talked to a lot of fishermen down there, and they are just at wit's end because they don't know what's going to be next. They know that the area that we have closed to fishing in the Gulf is now 34% of the federal waters. States are closing parts of their fisheries, their waters accordingly. And we have worked with the Food and Drug Administration and with the states to identify protocols to open up areas once we have tested them and made sure that they are safe, because one of our goals is to keep the integrity of the seafood supply safe. And so we've been working closely with fishermen on those protocols, and so they understand, and so they can be part of the effort. But I can tell you that there is just great, great anxiety and angst, and I think that will continue. The federal government is very concerned about that. I was in the Gulf, I mentioned, with the Vice President last week, and this was an area that he spent a lot of time talking about. And he said to the fishermen, I think that what you are going through is not unlike what soldiers go through when they come back from war. This is post-traumatic stress syndrome, and you are all individuals that are very self-sufficient. You need to watch out for each other. You need to ask for help when you need help or when your buddy needs help. And we have been working closely with some of the other federal agencies and with the states to try to increase the support that's available for communities, for individuals, for very diverse populations, in part because I think they are at serious risk. And again, this is really a human tragedy and an environmental disaster, and they are so intimately intertwined, and it's going to be a long time before things will be made whole. But we are committed to seeing it through that. President Obama has charged the Secretary of Navy, Ray Mabus, who is the former governor of Mississippi, with leading the federal effort to a full recovery. And Secretary Mabus is really thinking long-term about this, and we are committed to seeing that through.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but I just want to say that Dr. Lubchenco is the first marine ecologist to lead NOAA, and I think I, for one, and I assume all of you are very grateful that you are in this position right now. Thank you all very much.